Welcome to Formosa Files. Today I'm talking to Michael Aldrich, a longtime resident of Taiwan and the author of several books on Asia, including a trilogy on three great cities, great cultural cities of Asia: Beijing, Ulaanbaatar, and most recently, Lhasa. A wonderful book called Old Lhasa, a Biography, which is a look at the history and culture of Lhasa through the years. And it's also a traveling companion that takes you around the various places you want to visit if you go to Lhasa and the surrounding area.
The Taiwan History Podcast, Formosa Files, is made possible through the generous sponsorship of the Frank C. Chen Foundation. Formosa Files.
So welcome aboard, Mike.
John, thanks for having me here today. And I'd also like to say thank you for saying nice things about my book. It was the result of several trips to Lhasa before the COVID pandemic. And I'm pleased to report that the book was named as one of the best books of 2023 by the website China Books Review. One of their comments, which I'm really flattered by, they called the book a luxurious tapestry.
In today's episode, we'll be looking at Taiwan-Tibet relations, and in particular, the landmark visit of the Dalai Lama to Taiwan in 1997. But first, perhaps you could say who and what the Dalai Lama is.
The Dalai Lama is the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism. He is the current occupant of a lineage that goes back at least 14 incarnations to the 15th century, and viewed in terms of Buddhist theological principles long before that. The current Dalai Lama is a gentleman who was born in 1935 in Amdo province, and he was recognized and then assumed his temporal and spiritual authority over Tibet in 1950. The year after that, the People's Liberation Army invaded Tibet and gradually wrested political control from Tibetans. In 1959, a revolt broke out against the Chinese occupation in the region, and the Dalai Lama and members of his government, his family, other notables, other religious leaders fled to India, where they established a government-in-exile in Dharamshala. In English, the government-in-exile is called the Central Tibetan Authority. As a point of clarification, John, when we refer to Taiwan-Tibet relations in our talk, we're actually talking about the Taiwanese government's unofficial relationship with the exiled Tibetan community and the Central Tibetan Authority, and not the PRC-installed authorities, which are in the Tibetan Autonomous Region, which is a part of the PRC.
Dharamshala and Taipei. Okay. On the surface, they seem to share a unique bond.
That's right. Despite occasional and brief attempts at rapprochement in the past, both Taipei and Dharamshala have been the target of Beijing's invective, condemned as agents of separatism and toadies of invidious foreign forces, all served up with the typical abrasive rhetoric that we've come to associate with Beijing. That said, even though they share a common opponent, Taipei and Dharamshala have experienced quite a bit of friction in the past.
Yes, friction, because of Taiwan's claims that Tibet is part of the ROC. Yes, that's obviously alienated these Tibetans in exile.
Yeah, I mean, as a theoretical matter, I guess, Taiwan still asserts that the Tibetan region falls under the sovereignty of the Republic of China. And this has been an assertion, it's a long-lived assertion that goes back even before the communist conquest. It has caused a lot of resentment and anger among Tibetans for a long time. In addition, Taiwan's had played this covert role, meddling, I guess you could say, in exiled Tibetan politics, backing insurgents in various political factions and figures, and doing so usually without Dharamsala's knowledge or approval. And this obviously became another source of friction. In particular, Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek was eagerly supporting the CIA's covert sponsorship of Tibetan guerrillas throughout the 1960s. And this occurred, again, without the knowledge of the Central Tibetan authorities.
So Taiwan and Tibet, a troubled relationship, but the stars were aligning in the late 1980s and the 1990s.
Yep, indeed. There was a shift in global perceptions going on back then. In 1989, the Dalai Lama won the Nobel Peace Prize. And by doing so, he secured worldwide sympathy for the cause of the Tibetan people. And within Taiwan, a political change was underway in the late 1980s and 90s. Greater political freedom, more diversity of opinion, and less lip service given to outdated ROC fantasies about retaking the mainland. This culminated with Taiwan's first elected president, Lee Teng-hui, inviting the Dalai Lama to visit the island in the early 1990s.
And in March 1997, he came. It was a truly historic trip. It happened as a result of and against a backdrop of various trends.
And some of these trends were the growth of Tibetan Buddhism both in Taiwan and around the world. This was at the same time we saw a diminishing interest among Taiwanese to reassert any claim to be the only legitimate government of China. So there was a natural attraction between those aspiring for Taiwanese independence and activists in support of the Tibetan cause.
I recall those days. There was a fair amount of Tibet fever, we might call it, in Taiwan and around the world. Two major movies came out later that year of 1997, two movies set in Tibet.
One, it was the 7 Years in Tibet, which is a Brad Pitt film.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also saw director Martin Scorsese's biopic of Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama, which was called Kundin. Personally, I prefer Kundin, as it is much more historically accurate. A Brad Pitt film has a lot of the lashings of invented storylines that you would expect from Hollywood.
The Tibetan Freedom Concert, a series of concerts. The first one was held the year before in San Francisco, 1996, and it had 100,000 attendees. And there were best-selling books on Tibet as well at that time.
Yeah, I mean, I still remember the stories about the Tibetan Freedom Concert. It is really entertaining to visualize the Red Hot Chili Peppers as being active proponents of His Holiness.
Yes.
But Taiwan's invitation to the Dalai Lama raised a question. All right, how are we going to treat this guy? As a visitor from the provinces? As ridiculous as that sounds, that is probably what a by-the-book approach would entail. Or would they treat him as a leader of a recognized government in exile?
Right, and the choice they made was something in between, not as a visiting head of state, but still getting the red carpet treatment.
And as for the people of Taiwan, when His Holiness the Dalai Lama arrived in the southern port city of Kaohsiung on Saturday, March 22nd, he received a very warm and enthusiastic welcome. Among the many thousands were a few hundred pro-independence demonstrators.
Independence for?
Both for Taiwan and Tibet. And of course, there's also a smaller number of demonstrators advocating reunification with China.
The then opposition party, the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, they weren't shy in stating that the emperor had no clothes, that Taiwan and Tibet were separate entities. And they also drew attention to this Mongolian and Tibetan Affairs Commission. They said it should be abolished. Later president, but mayor of Taipei at the time, Chen Shui-bian, I think he flew the Tibetan flag over City Hall, and likewise other DPP-controlled cities.
The Taiwanese government and the Dalai Lama were really quite keen to downplay independence talk. The trip was promoted as being about Buddhism, and not just Tibetan Buddhism. For example, the Dalai Lama had long expressed considerable interest in learning about the local custom here for the ordination of nuns. I should emphasize the full ordination, as that was part of his goal to take Tibetan Buddhism out of the ancient medieval customs and modernize it.
So on the Dalai Lama's trip, there were prayer meetings in various cities, and these had huge attendances. And television stations broadcast live coverage of the ceremonies throughout the 6-day visit. The first event was at a sports stadium in Kaohsiung, and it was attended by 50,000 people.
Now, I don't want to cast any aspersions here, but Taiwanese businessmen were quick to see a business opportunity and jumped on the bandwagon, selling merchandise like photographs of His Holiness and various religious paraphernalia.
The first 4 days of his 6-day visit were devoted entirely to religious events.
Although on the last 2 days there were political meetings, the climax being a meeting with President Lee Donghui, these were presented as being non-political exchanges.
Right. President Lee was a Presbyterian, and a serious one. He was a lay preacher. So this historic meeting did have a strong and genuine philosophical flavor.
But as you'd expect, Beijing saw things differently. The CCP said that the religious element was a cover for two splittists plotting separatist activities.
Splittists, oh, so evil.
Indeed, you should have a minor chord music coming in at that.
Yeah. The Dalai Lama's visit was part of a dramatic increase of interest in Tibetan Buddhism in Taiwan. At the time, I think there were over 200 Tibetan Buddhist centers registered with the Taiwanese authorities. Yeah, and it's hard to know, but maybe hundreds of thousands of followers.
This dramatic increase of interest, I think, was based on multiple elements which makes Tibetan Buddhism very attractive. For an example, there certainly was a part of this interest in Tibet that was part of a fad, a worldwide trend. But still, Tibetan Buddhism had and has a strong and enduring appeal, especially with respect to the Dalai Lama's teaching about compassion, respect for science and logic, and nonviolence.
Mm-hmm. Many of these reasons are the same as those that make Tibetan Buddhism attractive for Western followers.
Yeah, certainly there is an exotic appeal of Tibet. The meditative practices are well regarded. There's a strong philosophical tradition. There's also a rich textual history, by which I mean a rich history of writings, and the attractive personality of many Tibetan teachers. It's a time-tested faith with a long lineage, and what is seen as a somewhat purer transmission through the centuries. This interest sort of hints to the reason why secular modernity doesn't really satisfy unfulfilled spiritual needs for many people.
Indeed. So, Mike, what do you think are some differences about Taiwanese followers?
Well, perhaps there's an attraction for a mijiao, esoteric religion, and perhaps an interest in supernatural qualities. But I think fundamentally it's simply an attraction to the teachings of His Holiness, which are certainly a balm in these tumultuous times.
Mm-hmm. And things have calmed down a little now, but if I'm looking back to 1997, some of the attraction to Tibetan Buddhism were the practical applications for money, for love, stock market tips and dating advice.
Sure. I mean, and His Holiness would be quick to scold people for doing so. But some Taiwanese believe that Tibetan Buddhist masters possess magical powers. So a Lama might be asked all manner of strange things. It could be anything from picking a stock or altering the weather. Now, the Dalai Lama has tried to dispel this kind of thing for a long time. But, I can see that people would say, but wait, during his second trip to Taiwan, which was in 2001, he sent a team of monks to perform an earthquake prevention ritual. But that's a little different insofar as that's more of an act of compassion. And as the Dalai Lama has also spun it, it's also a ritual that behooves people to have a more mindful approach to the environment. So it's a little different than, getting some inside information on how you can win the lottery. That's the sort of end result of certain petitioners that would definitely leave His Holiness feeling quite cold, to say the least.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Anyway, let's have a quick look at the history of Tibetan Buddhism in Taiwan. Basically, it starts with the exodus of mainlanders with the fall of China to the communists in 1949.
Right. Some mainland followers of Tibetan Buddhism established religious centers on the island after the retreat from the mainland. And most of the early teachers were themselves were either Chinese or heavily Sinified Tibetans.
Okay, so basically Tibetan Buddhism conducted by and for mainland Chinese.
In some ways. The situation changed in the 1980s. Many exiled Tibetans, some from India mostly, visited Taiwan to enroll in educational and other programs here. Then Taiwanese could travel overseas more freely after 1979 to India, for example, and at a later date even to Tibet. These growing connections were also built on programs run by the Mongolian and Tibetan Affairs Commission, which formerly was a branch of the executive government. These were sponsored educational programs for university students, language training, and vocational training for Tibetans here in Taiwan.
And some funds were made available for study in other places. Perhaps most surprisingly, 400 or so Tibetan Muslims went to Saudi Arabia to study. 400 to Saudi Arabia. This was before 1990 when the kingdom switched diplomatic relations from Taipei to Beijing.
Yeah, that's right. It's easy for us to forget, but there is a notable Muslim minority that has been part of Tibetan life going back for centuries. His Holiness often has referred to the Muslims in Lhasa as ornaments of this great city.
It was quite revealing reading your book, Old Lhasa, to learn about the Muslim community there.
And their exceptionally strong relationship between the Muslims and the Buddhists, which still exists. You have Tibetan Muslim communities in northern India where they still preserve many Lhasan customs and traditions, cuisine and the like, and present stories of really, really cordial and warm relations with Tibetan Buddhists and His Holiness. From 1980 to 1990, the Mongolian Tibet Affairs Commission ran a program that brought 6-year-old Tibetan children here for long-term study. The program was disbanded because the children became so acculturated to Taiwanese life that they were not able to reintegrate into the Tibetan exile community. Actually, I remember in those years, I met one Tibetan fellow who was raised in Taiwan, and his mannerisms, his way of speaking, his way of interacting was fully Taiwanese. There was nothing that was really overtly Tibetan about the guy.
Interesting. As well as positive religious and educational connections between Taiwan and the exiled Tibetan community, there were over the decades some problems with other Taiwanese involvement, financing exile groups, including those involved in military action.
This was, part of the cloak and dagger world. As part of Taiwan's ongoing covert operations, Taiwanese support basically drove a rift between Tibetan guerrillas who were operating in the Mustang region of Nepal. I think this was inadvertent on the part of the Taiwanese agents, but it also reflected a lack of understanding about the different factions that exist in the Tibetan community, or the fact that, sadly, the Tibetan community often can be incredibly fractious.
Yes. Well, of course, Tibet takes in a huge, huge region with many different ethnic groups.
That's right.
Anyway, there were scandals related to Taiwan in 1989 and 1994, which exposed major divisions among the exiles. And these divisions were based partly on regional and sectarian differences. Regional resentments about central Tibetans dominating the exile community, at least against the central Tibetan administration. And yes, there were other groups other than the central Tibetan administration that were getting funds from Taiwan.
Right. The Dalai Lama's first visit in 1997 marked the beginning of a new phase in the Taiwan-Tibet exile friendship. It brought to an end a long period of suspicion and frustration between the central Tibet administration and the Taiwanese government.
Right. That secretive ROC involvement in Tibet for the ROC's own purposes, not so much for the Tibetans, and of course the claim to Tibet it had strained relations.
A major outcome of His Holiness's visit was Taiwan's first unofficial contact with the exile government and the establishment of an Office of Tibet in Taiwan. After the visit, we saw a growth of interest in Tibetan Buddhism, and the number of religious centers and followers increased along with better relations.
Mike, you recently went and had a chat with the chief representative of the office which handles the Taiwan-Tibet relationship. How do you pronounce his name?
Oh, it's Kelsang Gyatsen.
One more time?
Kelsang Gyaltsen. Yeah, I had a very pleasant chat with him. He was born in Sichuan, obviously of Tibetan ethnic background. And for some years, he was a member of the PRC's United Front. until he and his family were able to defect to India. He's an extremely charming man, very outgoing, very friendly. And he's also a connoisseur of fine Jinmin Gallian.
Okay, a pleasant chat for you. But this is diplomacy, so it's sensitive. So although he speaks English well, you conducted your interview in Chinese.
That's right. We've translated that into English and it has gotten his approval. I asked him, can you tell us a little bit about the relations between the Central Tibetan Administration in Dharamshala and the Taiwanese government? And his response was,
the Mongolian and Tibetan Affairs Commission used to be part of the central government structure set up in accordance with the Constitution of the Republic of China. While Taiwan was becoming a mature democracy, it has been difficult to amend its constitution. Further, many traditional officials in the government of the Republic of China, especially members of the KMT, had a deep-rooted belief that Tibet is part of China. This is why the Mongolian and Tibetan Affairs Commission continued to be in existence for many years. It was also staffed with many Tibetans who came to Taiwan with the government of the Republic of China. Because the commission did not recognize Tibetan sovereignty, the Central Tibet Administration was not permitted to have official contact with the commission. To meet this challenge, His Holiness the Dalai Lama established a non-profit organization in Taipei in 1997. This NGO is the Tibet Religious Foundation of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, which enabled the government-in-exile to have indirect contact with the commission. The foundation and the commission continued to exist side by side until 2017, when the ROC government disbanded the commission and set up a Mongolian and Tibetan Cultural Center under the Ministry of Culture. The functions of the new institution significantly departed from those of the commission, and thus we have been able to have a lot of interaction with the center in terms of cultural projects. So, since 2017, the relationship between the government in Taiwan and the Tibetan government has become more normalized. First, the people of Taiwan have faith and love for the Tibetan religion and Buddhism. Second, the Taiwan government, especially during the Chen Shui-bian era and now during the Tsai Ing-wen era, has been very courteous and respectful to us. Although it is not possible for Taiwan to provide policy support to Tibet like the United States and European countries, or to support Tibet through an act in the Legislative Yuan, it often does so with assorted projects. When there is a special Tibetan issue that is not allowed by the law, the Taiwanese government usually solves it by means of a project. So the interaction and contact between the Taiwan government and the Tibetan government is getting better.
Excellent. So from 1997 to 2017, to put an end to the MTAC. It's a long time, but at least change in the right direction. And it's a very friendly relationship today.
Yes, the ties between the Taiwanese government and the Central Tibetan Administration reveal that significant diplomatic exchanges often occur throughout the world without the existence of formal ties. This is a trend that is only likely to increase in the years ahead. I mean, the Somaliland-Taiwan relationship is another example how strong bonds can be created. Various programs of cooperation come into existence, and there's a people-to-people exchange without formal diplomatic recognition. I believe that the Taiwan-Tibet relationship will continue to develop and deepen over time despite uncertainties. While I'm not in the business of forecasting the future, it seems that when His Holiness passes on, there will be two claimants to the title of the 15th Dalai Lama, one selected by the CCP and the other by Dharamshala. I don't think that the schism will impact the informal Taiwan-Tibetan ties, given the shared values of the two regions. And also, His Holiness assures us he will live to the age of 110. So we won't be dealing with this all that soon, hopefully.
Hopefully, yes. It's been great talking to you, Mike. And I'll just remind readers about your wonderful book, Old Lhasa, a Biography.
Thank you, John. Very kind. It's always wonderful to chat with you.
Likewise.